So yeah, the gerrymandering of Befindlichkeit's basically just you think about the way that you take a population and then you carve up the voting district in some weird way to make it a predictable, reliable demographic. That's what we all become through the internet. Well, what are we going to do about it? What do we need? We need large-scale structural change. The way we want to talk about that is T3 institutions. T3 stands for time, energy, talent, and teaching or tutelage, right? But those would be institutions that are not like most of our educational institutions today for the reasons that I already talked about. And so we need those, and we need those big and small. So local and universal kinds of projects that would focus on getting people their time, energy so that they can discover and then cultivate their talent under tutelage or teachers. Okay, so that's first. But finally, what this brings us all to is that capitalism and the exploitation of labor power and the exploitation of the Earth's resources doesn't just undermine our ability to have a meaningful life with like time in the day to have relationships and do the things that we care about. It's also undermining our ability to keep living on this planet, right? The erosion of soil that leads to dust bowls, the extraction of large-scale agriculture that leads to food that is only a simulacrum of food, not just hyper-processed, but also the produce aisle. These are simulacra of corn, simulacra of vegetables, right? These vegetables do not have the nutrient density. And it's in part because they're being picked so ahead of their season, right? Living within the cycles of the planet, and then also like learning how to care and tend for the earth is kind of like the next big phase of thinking about this stuff. And so we use N3 to talk about that. And so I'll just put those right here. And in the last like 3 minutes, I'll just say something about each of these three things. We have nature as the first one. We have nurture. And then we have natality. And I'll start with the last and just say that natality is being towards birth as opposed to being towards death. Maybe during the Q&A, if the opportunity arises, I'll read a couple quotes about natality. I have some fantastic ones here from Jennifer Banks's book, Natality, Toward a Philosophy of Birth. But for now, I'll just say it's being towards birth as opposed to being towards death. It's a way of thinking intergenerationally as opposed to individually. Thinking forward generations. And then nurture. The idea of nurture is that we should be nurturing human beings, animals, plants, and soil. And then nature has to do with the contingencies and necessities that we find ourselves confronted with by the things that would be there regardless of whether we had a society or not, right? And so there's necessary contingencies and contingent necessities, and the coalescence of those things are something that we have to cope with and strategize about, to deal with, to harness, but to also safeguard against, because nature is violent, it's risky, it's dangerous, but it also brings natality, it brings the blossoming of new life and opportunities. But ultimately, nurture is what I want to think about, because normally we think about oppression and then we think and domination, and this gets us thinking within a sort of binary where there's mutually exclusive sides between oppressors and oppressed groups. And I like what Wendell Berry says in The Unsettling of America, which is that this is a problem, this idea of mutually exclusive groups that have like these essential natures. He would prefer to think about it in terms of nurture versus exploitation. And then he says that this distinction between nurture and exploitation is one that exists not just between groups, but within every one of us. It runs through the heart of man in a sort of sense. And so I think that to have T3 institutions or to reclaim our time energy ultimately requires getting in touch with the realities of nature and then learning how to nurture humans, animals, plants, and soil. And that's kind of what we're doing out here on the farm. And I started by talking about how I was growing up out here and I hated it and I ran away. And now here I am back. I'm like the prodigal son in a sort of sense. And it's because I realized it wasn't really my parents' fault that they didn't have time energy. That's a political economic problem. And I think ultimately, though I might have a lot of disagreements with them on various things, I think that they have a pretty good idea about what they're doing and that they're ultimately out here building soil the same way that I want to and the same way that Anne wants to. And so, yeah, that's what we're out here doing. So thanks for having me, everybody. This is great.